10 history discoveries that changed everything. The bones that rewrote where you come from. In 1974, a research team digging in Ethiopia found pieces of a skeleton so old it made the pyramids look brand new. They called her Lucy. Here's why she mattered. Scientists had always assumed our ancestors developed big brains first and started walking upright later. Lucy's bones said the opposite. Her pelvis and leg bones proved her species was already walking on 2 legs long before brain size caught up. Think about that for a second. Walking came first, thinking came later. And Lucy wasn't alone. The town child, found decades earlier in South Africa, first pointed scientists toward Africa as humanity's true birthplace. A skeleton called Ardi pushed the evidence of upright walking back even further. Stone tools found at Olduvai Gorge showed our ancestors shaping objects with their hands nearly 2 million years ago. But here's the question nobody could answer yet. Once humans figured out how to walk, how long until they figured out how to build? The answer came from a city that shouldn't have existed as early as it did, and when archaeologists finally studied it properly, what they found inside its houses didn't match anything they expected from the ancient world. The city that shouldn't have been fair. Around 2600 BCE, while most early civilizations were building massive palaces for their kings, one city in the Indus Valley built almost nothing for its rulers at all. No throne room, no royal tomb stuffed with gold, not even a name for a king that survives today. The city was Mohenjo-Daro, and for decades, archaeologists just assumed the evidence hadn't survived. Then, researchers tried something different. They measured the size of ordinary houses across the city and ran the numbers through a formula used to measure inequality in modern economies. The result should have shown a city getting more unequal as it grew. That's what happens almost everywhere else in the ancient world. Instead, the numbers showed the opposite. As Mohenjo-Daro grew larger and more advanced, the gap between rich and poor actually shrank. That statistic alone breaks a rule historians assumed was universal. So what happened to a civilization that had almost figured out fairness before anyone else? Nobody fully knows. But while Mohenjo-Daro was quietly building equality, something even stranger was happening. 1,000 miles northwest, people were dragging a 6-ton rock across an entire country for a reason researchers wouldn't fully understand until 2024. The rock that travelled further than it should have been able to. At the centre of Stonehenge sits a stone that never should have gotten there. It's called the altar stone, and for years, geologists knew one thing for certain: it didn't belong. The rock didn't match anything found in southern England. Researchers eventually traced it to Scotland, but Scotland is a big place, and pinning down an exact origin seemed impossible. Until scientists zoomed in on something microscopic, tiny mineral grains inside the rock called zircons, each one carrying a kind of geological fingerprint. That fingerprint led them to one specific spot in Caithness, at the far northeastern edge of the Scottish mainland, nearly 700 kilometers away. Naturally, researchers checked whether glaciers could have carried the stone south on their own. It would have made a much less impressive story, but the geology didn't support it. No plausible ice route lines up, which leaves one explanation. People, without wheels, without draft animals strong enough for the job, carried a 6-ton stone across roughly 700 kilometers of Neolithic Britain. If that's true, what else were ancient societies capable of that we've never given them credit for? Around this same period, on the other side of the world, a king was ruling a city that would one day inspire the oldest story ever written, down a story that would vanish for 2,000 years before a burning building gave it back. The king who refused to accept death. Around 2700 BCE, a real king ruled a real city in what's now Iraq. His name was Gilgamesh, and centuries after his death, people were still telling stories about him. Then, for over 2,000 years, his story disappeared completely. In 1849, an English archaeologist named Austin Henry Layard was digging through the ruins of a destroyed palace near Mosul. The building above ground was gone. But underneath it, he found tens of thousands of clay tablets, the remains of a royal library. Among them was the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's considered the oldest great work of literature on earth, older than the Bible, older than Homer. It follows a king desperately trying to escape death after watching his closest friend die. Strip away 4,000 years, And it's a story about grief and mortality that feels almost uncomfortably familiar. But here's what should really unsettle you. If a king's own story could vanish for 2,000 years and only survive by accident, buried under rubble, what happened to the stories of every other ruler who wasn't so lucky? One answer was about to bury itself even deeper, inside a tomb built for a boy king nobody expected to matter at all. The boy king who wasn't supposed to be remembered. He ruled for about 10 years. He died before he turned 20. By every normal measure of ancient Egyptian power, Tutankhamun should have been forgotten. Instead, he became the most famous pharaoh who ever lived. Here's the twist. It's almost entirely because he failed to matter. Powerful pharaohs got powerful tombs, and powerful tombs got robbed. Tutankhamun's tomb was small, easy to overlook, and largely ignored by grave robbers for over 3,000 years. In 1922, British archaeologist Howard Carter finally broke through into the burial chamber. What he found stunned the world. Over 5,000 artifacts, a solid gold coffin, a dagger forged from meteorite iron, and the golden death mask you'd recognize instantly today. But that's not the whole story. If a minor, largely forgettable teenage king was buried with this much wealth, what did Egypt's truly legendary rulers take into the ground with them? We may never know. Almost every other tomb in the Valley of the Kings had already been stripped bare centuries earlier. While Egypt's tombs were being looted on land, a completely different Egyptian city was thriving out at sea until the sea simply swallowed it whole. The city that sank and took Egypt's wealth with it. For 1,000 years, if you sailed from Greece into Egypt, there was only one door you walked through, a city called Thonis Heracleion. Then, one day, the door itself disappeared, not destroyed by war, not conquered, swallowed. The city grew enormously wealthy as Egypt's main gateway port, wealthy enough to build a massive temple to the god Amun. The historian Herodotus even wrote about it, claiming Helen of Troy once passed through the city with Paris right before the Trojan War began. Then, rising seas, sinking land, and possibly earthquakes pulled the entire city underwater. For over 1,000 years, almost nobody remembered it had ever been real. It stayed lost until the year 2000, when a French archaeologist finally located it beneath the waves of Abu Qir Bay. Divers have since pulled up coins, statues, the wreckage of 79 ships, and a colossal 20-foot stone head believed to depict the Egyptian god of the Nile's flood. An entire civilization, hidden for 1,000 years, found almost by accident. That wouldn't be the last time archaeologists stumbled onto something massive without meaning to. The next discovery wasn't hiding underwater. It was hiding underground, guarded by an army of 8,000 soldiers made of clay. The farmers who accidentally found an army. In 1974, a group of farmers in China were just trying to dig a well. Instead, their shovels hit something that had been standing guard underground for over 2,000 years. What they'd stumbled onto was an entire buried army, more than 8,000 life-size terracotta soldiers built to protect the tomb of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China. Every face was different. Every soldier stood exactly where he was placed over 2 millennia ago. Here's the part that should really get you. The army is only a small piece of the full site. The tomb complex is estimated to cover nearly 40 square miles, and most of it, including the emperor's actual burial chamber, still hasn't been touched. Ancient records describe rivers of mercury flowing through a model of the empire inside that chamber. If that sounds like exaggeration, consider this. Soil tests around the site have actually found unusually high mercury levels. So what's really down there, still unopened after over 2,000 years? Historians didn't expect what happened next, either because while China's first emperor was busy hiding an army underground, a very different kind of discovery, thousands of miles away, was about to unlock an entire vanished language. The broken rock that made an entire civilization speak again. For over 1,000 years, nobody on Earth could read Egyptian hieroglyphics. Not scholars, not priests, not a single person alive. Then, in 1799, soldiers rebuilding a fort near the town of Rosetta accidentally pulled a slab of stone out of an old wall. At first glance, it looked unremarkable, but it carried the same decree written out 3 separate times, once in hieroglyphics, once in a simpler Egyptian script, and once in ancient Greek. Greek, scholars could already read. That was the crack in the door. For over 2 decades, researchers across Europe raced to use it. British scholar Thomas Young made early progress. But it was French linguist Jean-François Champollion who finally broke the code completely in 1822, using his fluency in a language descended from ancient Egyptian to match sounds to symbols. Almost overnight, an entire silent civilization could speak again. But while Egyptologists were finally learning to read Egypt's past, a very different kind of disaster, nearly 2,000 years earlier, had already frozen an entire Roman city in place. And it would take almost 17 centuries before anyone found it again. The city that vanished in a single afternoon. One ordinary morning in 79 CE, people in a Roman city were baking bread, running shops, walking to work. By nightfall, they were all dead, and their city was buried under millions of tons of volcanic ash. Mount Vesuvius had erupted, and Pompeii disappeared in less than a day. For the people living through it, it was one of the worst disasters in the ancient world. For historians nearly 2,000 years later, it became one of archaeology's greatest gifts. The ash sealed everything so completely that when excavations finally began in the 16th century, they found a city frozen at a single moment, bread still in ovens, graffiti still on the walls, and the hollow shapes of bodies preserved so precisely that archaeologists could fill them with plaster and see the exact position people died in. It's the closest thing historians have to a photograph of the ancient world. But Pompeii wasn't the only place where disaster accidentally preserved history. Centuries later, in England, a landowner would stumble onto something almost as remarkable, not buried by fire, but hidden under quiet grassy hills for over 1,000 years. The Dark Age that wasn't actually dark. In 1939, right before World War II began, a landowner in Suffolk, England, decided to dig into a few grassy mounds sitting on her own property. What she found rewrote an entire era of history. Buried underneath was an entire ship, its wood long since rotted away, but its outline still preserved in the soil, packed with Anglo-Saxon gold, garnet jewelry, ceremonial armor, and an iconic helmet. Before this discovery, historians described early medieval Britain as a crude, impoverished, dark age. Sutton Hoo destroyed that idea in a single afternoon. Whoever was buried there, likely a king of East Anglia, commanded wealth and craftsmanship connected to trade routes stretching across Europe. Not exactly what you'd expect from a supposedly dark, forgotten era.